I want to bring our viewers up to date. It's now 10:30 on the East Coast, 7:30 on the West Coast. It has been 1 hour and 30 minutes ago that Space Shuttle Columbia lost contact. Let's go to the latest briefing right now from NASA.
By Mission Control since that time. Search and rescue authorities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in portions of East Texas and other pertinent areas have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Any debris that is found that may be related to the Space Shuttle's contingency should be avoided and may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants that are used on board the Space Shuttle. The locations of any possible debris should be reported immediately to local law enforcement authorities. In Mission Control, flight controllers continue through contingency procedures designed to secure all information, data, and notes pertinent to today's descent of the Space Shuttle Columbia. This is Mission Control, Houston.
We've been listening live to an update from Mission Control in Houston, where they are essentially saying that contingency plans are now in effect after they lost connection with and any kind of communication with the Space Shuttle Columbia. They announced that they were putting their contingency plans into effect. That includes search and rescue teams on the ground somewhere outside of Dallas or Fort Worth or Plano, Texas, where there have been reports of sightings in the area of potentially people who could see the shuttle as it was coming down. There seems to be little doubt that indeed the pictures that we've been showing you of something sort of falling apart as it re-enters from space is in fact the shuttle Columbia. We have heard NASA talking about their search and rescue efforts, and also we have heard some word potentially about the thrusters, the auxiliary power units, that may have been a problem. It seems at this point at least that people are downplaying any potential thought of terrorism, as the shuttle was some 200,000 feet above the ground, which seems to be way out of the range of any sort of surface-to-air missiles being able to attack essentially any kind of thing in the air at that distance. So 16 minutes before the scheduled landing, the Columbia lost radio communication with NASA. The shuttle was making its final approach on what appeared to be a perfect mission. 16 days. We're doing scientific research that went very well. 80 experiments into ant and bee and spider behavior and weightlessness. They had a small glitch, a dehumidifier that was apparently not working, running things slightly warmer than they had hoped, but that seemed to be a very, very minor problem. There are, of course, questions about security. The security not only at all in the wake of 9/11, all the shuttle takeoffs and landings, but particularly this time because an Israeli soldier, the first Israeli astronaut on board, along with 6 Americans. So we have been getting updates not only from NASA, but also the NBC people on the ground as well at the White House. Now President Bush making his way and expected back to the White House sometime around noon today. And we know that the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs have convened a domestic event meeting basically to try to assess their response at this point to this event. We are keeping you up to date on everything that is happening at this point.
And let's go back right now to NBC's Jay Barbary, who has been following developments for us from Florida, from the site where the Space Shuttle was expected to have landed a little over an hour ago, 9:16 a.m. Eastern Time. Jay, what are you hearing?
Well, I'm being told by NASA that they're working on an official statement that they expect to get out shortly. Now, that could be in the next hour or so, and the official statement should tell us precisely where we are as NASA knows it at this hour. They will follow that later with a news conference. No time given yet on the news conference by the experts at Mission Control and what they know. They know little at this time, except they did lose some sensors, as we said before, David, and then shortly after that they lost communications. And they lost tracking. There was no tracking after a straight-up 9 o'clock hour, which was 8 o'clock in Texas, 8 a.m., and we want to reemphasize again, anyone approaching the debris of the Shuttle Columbia in Texas, possibly even into Louisiana, not to get close to that debris, to stay away from it, keep people away from it, report it to the nearest law agencies, and rope that off and stay away and wait for the experts, because you have very poisonous gases that are involved there, and it takes a while for them to dissipate. You do not want to breathe any of that, because if you do, it could take your life. So stay away from it if you see any debris anywhere. hopefully, here is Mission Control again. If we can bring up James Hartsfield at this time, we can get the latest.
Designed to secure all information and data pertinent to today's descent by the Space Shuttle Columbia. Communications with the Space Shuttle Columbia were lost at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time this morning at an altitude of about 200,000 feet above north-central Texas, as Columbia was en route to a landing planned at 8:16 a.m. Central Time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. At the time communication was lost, Columbia was traveling approximately 12,500 miles per hour. Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth vicinity and in portions of East Texas and other pertinent areas have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Any debris that may be related to the Space Shuttle contingency that is located should be avoided and may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants that are used on board the Space Shuttle. Any locations of debris should be immediately reported to local law enforcement agencies. This is Mission Control, Houston.
Jay, when you hear Mission Control in Houston talk about Dallas-Fort Worth, East Texas, and other pertinent areas, I speculated a few minutes ago that this debris could cover an area of several hundred square miles. But are you getting any indication whatsoever as to what the debris field is from what we certainly now believe, and certainly NASA is saying, are the remnants of the Space Shuttle Columbia?
Was that this is Jay, David. Was that question to me?
Yes, Jay.
Yes, no, we do not know yet, but hopefully when they come up with their news conferences, they will have, at that time, computerized where exactly that debris could be, because, as you said, there's little doubt that it is Columbia, and Columbia broke up, as did Challenger, coming through the atmosphere, and the debris could cover a large area, because it began to break up at 39 miles up, where with Challenger it was only a few thousand feet up. I forget exactly the height at the time, and it covered about 50 square miles. So this could be a couple of hundred square miles or more. So I'm only guessing. I want to point out I'm only guessing because of the height there, the altitude in which Columbia came apart.
Jay, it's Soledad in New York, and I want to take a look at some pictures from January 16th. This is when the Columbia took off for its 16-day mission, a mission that up to now everyone has described as very uneventful, 80 scientific experiments on board, apparently all of them going off without a hitch. I want to talk a little bit about, you see a takeoff like this, and in the wake of the Challenger accident, of course, people now watch very closely. This is the risky part of the entire process.
Yes, it is.
Relatively speaking, it's the re-entry is considered pretty straightforward, isn't it?
It sure is, and as you said, the risky part is when they're going up, when they're still on the solid rockets. That's 2 minutes and 8 seconds, but I can tell you, I've covered every one of these shuttle launches, in fact, every manned space flight by the United States of America. And this was the 144th mission by America into space. And I can't remember when we had such a perfect weather flight. Not one hair on my head was blown as the Shuttle Columbia took off. It was just a gorgeous day, no clouds in the sky, and it was uneventful as they took off and went into space. It has been an uneventful flight. We have been following it for 16 days. We've had nothing really to report, and it has been totally uneventful. And nothing. It was uneventful this morning. The deorbit burn took place on time. They had a little question about fog on the ground here, if they wanted to wait another orbit, let the fog dissipate. But they didn't, because it was perfect. Everything was perfect. It was one of these things that could happen anytime, like if you're driving your car down the interstate, everything is rolling along perfectly. Then something happens unforeseen, and your car literally comes apart. So we don't know what happened there this morning, but we do know that whatever it was, the astronauts did not have a chance to report it because their communication system was at least lost immediately. Whether or not they were lost immediately is still a question we do not know or may never know.
All right, Jay, thanks very much. I want you to continue to stand by. We have former astronaut Buzz Aldrin on the line. Buzz, you've been talking to us a little bit about an astronaut's perspective in all of this. As we saw pictures of the takeoff on an absolutely glorious day on January 16th, that's really the tense time, isn't it, for the astronauts? It's not really the re-entry that's nerve-wracking, or am I wrong?
Well, both phases of flight are extremely dangerous because of the tremendous exchanges of energy that are taking place. During launch, you have to put that energy into the spacecraft through the rocket thrust of the various stages. And you penetrate the atmosphere going up, going rather fast. And that was the time period that the Challenger had its breakup as it went through the maximum dynamic pressure. Now, the reentry phase, that energy that's stored in the spacecraft, in orbit, has to be dissipated for it to return back to the runway and land on the Earth. So that energy has to be dissipated through heat and light and motion. And that's rather traumatic, and that's why we have to put the thermal protection heat shield tiles on the craft for the reentry heating that has to be dissipated.
NASA points out, Buzz, that in 42 years they never have lost a shuttle upon landing. Of course, as you said, in 1986 it was the Challenger's takeoff that was the huge problem there. NASA's talked a little bit about contingency plans and search and rescue teams that they have sent out. Does the shuttle have the equivalent of a plane's black box that will be able to determine what exactly happened here at some point?
I'm sorry, would you say that again, please?
We have obviously been having a little audio issues, so let me repeat my question for you. My question was, we've heard NASA talk a little bit about their contingency plans and the search and rescue, but is there sort of the equivalent of what we hear in plane crashes, the black box, where they can find the data recorder and basically figure out what exactly caused the accident?
Well, you'll have to talk to someone who's more familiar with all of the portions of the shuttle. It's very hard to predict what might be survivable in terms of a black box, if that's what you were talking about.
All right, Buzz, thanks very much. We're going to ask you to stick around for us. We certainly appreciate your time.
Buzz, just quickly before you go, have you had a chance to reach out to any of your old friends at NASA? Are they telling you anything behind the scenes that we're not hearing from their official announcements?
No, the phone has been very busy. My son works for Boeing in Houston that has to do with some shuttle and station activities. And I know that he is on his return from California back to Houston, and he stopped for the weekend of skiing in Colorado. So I put a call into his cell phone, but he didn't answer.
Okay, Buzz Aldrin, thank you so much for your insight and your expertise and your great knowledge in this field. Let's go back to NBC's Rosalind Jordan. She's been standing by at the White House, where President Bush is expected to arrive in about an hour, right, Rosalind?
That is correct, David, and we are also finding out now from the White House that the president was informed by Chief of Staff Andrew Card when this incident happened just about 2 hours ago. The president is on his way back from Camp David, where he was going to spend the weekend. At this moment, the White House is still monitoring what is happening down in Houston at Mission Control, monitoring the information gathering process, and certainly consulting with officials over at the Pentagon on how best to respond to the situation.
And of course, all of us remember those pictures oh so well of Andrew Card, the president's chief of staff, whispering to him at that elementary school on September 11th when the attacks on the World Trade Center and later the Pentagon occurred. And so it's not surprising that his chief of staff is the one that breaks the news to him.
That is correct. As our viewers may or may not know, the president does get a daily intelligence and security briefing. Certainly, Mr. Card is a part of that process. But, you know, as you point out, the historic context is certainly remarkable at this particular moment. David?
All right, Rosalind, thanks very much for that update for us. I want to go back to Jay Barbary, and we want to show Jay pictures on January 16th of the crew as they boarded the shuttle. Tell me a little bit about the 7-member team on board.
Well, I can't see, unfortunately, I can't see the pictures, but I can remember Soledad, them coming out. The crew, we had 6 Americans and the first Israeli astronaut. Excuse me. And the Israeli astronaut, Ilan Ramon, is a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. He'd been waiting 2 years to go up. The commander, Rich Husband, this was his first command flight. He'd flown as pilots before, on 2 flights before on the shuttle. Willie McCool, the pilot, it was his first flight. Then we had, they called her DC that was on board. I'm sorry here. I've got a little frog in my throat, Soledad. But anyway, the others had flown before. We had a couple of the mission specialists that were rookies also on board.
The other mission
they
specialists.
They had waited a long time to get up to this flight, and it had gone just absolutely perfect for them. And then to have this tragedy happen at the end of the flight is just a little hard to take.
Jay, let me ask you about the families of the astronauts. We were told that they had been waiting there at Cape Canaveral at the Kennedy Space Center for their family members to land, for the exuberant welcome that they would receive. What's going on with them now, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, David, that's traditional. They do wait here for them to land, and then they go back with them to the astronauts' quarters on the Kennedy Space Center. I'm sure they were taken back to the astronauts' quarters. They're there waiting, and they will be given the information as it comes in. But that happens each time because it takes the astronauts even up there for 16 days. It takes them a day or two to really get their land legs back. So they go over generally, and the first thing that they like to do is have a good shower and then have a good meal with their families. So they were waiting here, and then tomorrow they would have flown back to Houston, all flown back together.
Jay, I think it's important to reiterate for our viewers the warning that you've been giving for the last, at least an hour or so. And just to recap, it's been now 1 hour and almost 47 minutes since the NASA lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. We've seen those horrific pictures of what almost certainly from NASA now essentially confirming were the debris of the Space Shuttle Challenger, some horrific malfunction aboard. But Jay, you've been saying, and NASA has been saying, that there is debris from Columbia in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in East Texas, and according to NASA, in other pertinent areas. And we don't know precisely where those are, but that jet fuel from the Space Shuttle Columbia, highly, highly toxic. Just explain that to our viewers again.
Yes, it's called hypergolic fuel, David. And what that means is that it has an oxidizer, and it has the fuel itself. And when you put this oxidizer in with this fuel, it ignites on contact. So that's how they can burn their rocket thrusters up there for a short while, and then shut them off, burn them for 2 seconds, or burn them for 2 minutes, whatever they need. So you have to have a reservoir of rocket fuel on board, both of them, 2 different tanks, bringing them together for the thruster rockets as well as for the orbital maneuvering rockets that they use to deorbit to come back in. And that fuel, if you breathe it, will form a membrane over the oxygen sacs in your lungs. And that membrane will suffocate you within 48 hours. And there's not much that you can do about it. You can get treatment, but we are all here educated to this at the launch site. We know that if the wind is blowing brown clouds, brown mist toward us to get out of that, one of the launch rules is not to launch when the wind is blowing in the direction of where people are. They want the wind blowing it out to sea. So anyone finding any debris in the Texas area or in the Louisiana area, anywhere that you might think this could be part of the Shuttle Columbia, don't go near it for that reason, because it's highly poisonous and you do not want to breathe it. And this is the way it hurts you, is to breathe the fumes from this. It wouldn't hurt you to touch it, but it certainly would hurt you to breathe it. So do not breathe it, stay away from it, bring in the proper authorities, and the authorities themselves should stay away from it. Because if you'll notice, when the shuttle lands here, the first thing that they do is they have these groups that go out, and they have on these protective suits, like radiation suits, and they have these huge windmills, and they bring these windmills up on wheels, and these windmills blows all the air away, dissipates it away from the shuttle itself for several minutes, and then they go in with testers to find out if it's safe so that workers without masks can approach it. So that takes anywhere from like 20 to 30 minutes to get all of that out of there at the time that they do. And if you recall, too, David, on the return of the last Apollo spacecraft, and you've been talking to Buzz Aldrin, who was the pilot on the lunar module pilot on board Apollo 11. On the last Apollo spacecraft, which was the Apollo-Soyuz, that was when we met the Russians in orbit and their Soyuz and hooked up there and came back. Well, on the way down, astronauts Tom Stafford, Deke Slayton, and Vance Brand. They were the three astronauts on board. Tom Stafford was a commander. He inadvertently opened up the ventilators on the... let's join Mission Control here in James Hartsfield for the latest.
Pertinent to today's descent by the Space Shuttle Columbia, communications were lost with the Space Shuttle Columbia at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time as Columbia was above north-central Texas at an altitude of 200,000 feet, traveling approximately 12,500 miles per hour. Search and rescue forces in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in other portions along Columbia's planned route have been alerted to the Space Shuttle program contingency. Any debris that may be found that may be related to the Space Shuttle contingency should be immediately reported to local authorities and avoided. Debris may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants used on board the Space Shuttle. Further information will be released as it becomes available. This is Mission Control, Houston.
Jay, I just want to add, while we keep you on the phone line with us and you continue to get updated information, that Bush administration officials are now saying that they have no immediate information that any sort of terrorism was involved in the NASA apparent destruction, certainly that's what it looks like, of the Space Shuttle Columbia.
And now might be a good time, actually, to head to the White House and get an update. NBC's David Gregory is standing by for us there. David, good morning to you.
Good morning, Soledad. To repeat for those who may just be joining us, the president, who was at Camp David this weekend, is now on his way back, motorcading down from the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. He is expected, once he gets more information from NASA, to address the nation in some capacity. We're not getting details on how he'll do that. He was informed shortly after this happened by his Chief of Staff, Andrew Card. There's a lot of activity here at the White House, as you can imagine. The National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, recently her motorcade arrived here at the White House. She is assuming her post in the West Wing and monitoring all the information she can. And again, the president returning now to the White House.
All right, NBC's David Gregory, thank you for that update. I want to take a moment, if we can, and just talk a little bit about the crew. There are 7, as we mentioned, people on board, 6 Americans and 1 Israeli, his first time in space as an astronaut. Let's talk about the commander first and foremost. Rick Husband, 45 years old. He's an Air Force colonel from Amarillo, Texas. It was a dream of his from the time that he was a child to be in space, and Columbia's launch was his second space flight. Then there's the pilot, William McCool, 41 years old, a Navy commander from Lubbock, Texas. He is the father of 3 sons, and this is was his first flight in space. Payload commander Michael Anderson, 43 years old. He is one really of only a handful of black astronauts. His home is from Spokane, Washington. And Kalpana Chawla, an immigrant to the United States from India. She became an astronaut in 1994. David Brown, a Navy captain and pilot and doctor. He became an astronaut in 1996, and Columbia's mission was his first space flight. Laurel Clark, she is a Navy diving medical officer on board submarines, and then became a flight surgeon. She has an 8-year-old son. And as we have mentioned before, the only Israeli on board, Ilan Ramon, a colonel in Israel's Air Force. He was a fighter pilot back in the 70s and the 80s and the early 1990s. His wife and his 4 children live in Tel Aviv. That is a list of the 7 people on board the Space Shuttle Columbia.
And again, it was 1 hour and 54 minutes ago, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 6 a.m. on the West Coast, that the NASA officials at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, and at Cape Canaveral in Florida lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia and that 7-man crew. The Space Shuttle Columbia had been scheduled to land in Florida at the Kennedy Space Center at 9:16 a.m. East Coast time. So it has now been almost 2 hours since they lost contact. Almost immediately, there were reports of explosions. There was this video that you're watching right now, taken of what we now know almost certainly to be, no doubt whatsoever from NASA, that this was indeed the explosion, the remnants of the Space Shuttle Columbia hurtling toward Earth. It had been traveling at 12,500 miles per hour, some 39 miles above the Earth when this catastrophic malfunction occurred. No official word yet from NASA as to the fate of the 7-person crew, but certainly very little reason to hope about their fate. Right now, let's go to NBC's chief science correspondent, Robert Bazell. Robert, what are you hearing?
Well, David, it was important that some administration officials have been saying that it's very unlikely that this could have been an act of terrorism from the ground, certainly because, as you pointed out, it was traveling at 200,000 feet above the Earth and at 12,500 miles an hour, and there are no surface-to-air missiles that could hit a vehicle like that. The concern about terrorism on this flight has been there all along, particularly people have talked about shuttles being potential terrorist targets ever since 9/11, and this one was particularly heightened because Colonel Ramon, the Israeli on board, was not just an Israeli, but he was also the leader of the attack on the nuclear facility in Iraq in 1981, and that made him quite a hero in Israel, but of course that would, again, lift the level of concern about his participation in the mission. There was no indication that anything went wrong during the descent. The things that we have no idea what will go wrong, we have no idea how long the investigation will take. The things that are possibilities or anything that are very similar to the things that you look at with an air crash. Could there have been some structural failure in the material? Could there have been some failure in the material that creates the heat shield, which, given at the enormous speed that it's decelerating through the atmosphere, if the heat shield doesn't work right, then the burning of the atmosphere comes right through and could blow up the aircraft. There is rocket fuel on board, which is the reason that Jay Barbary was talking about people on the ground should be careful not to touch it. There is rocket fuel on board, which remains poisonous, but it also is potentially explosive.
Robert, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second because this is video that we have not seen on the air before. This is obviously a different view of what is almost certainly some portion of the Space Shuttle Columbia as it is hurtling toward Earth from, as we've said, some 39 miles up in the sky when we believe this catastrophic malfunction occurred. We've seen a different angle up to this point of what we believe to be the remnants of the Space Shuttle Columbia hurtling almost straight down. That seems to be a side angle as the debris came closer to Earth, because if we can cue that up again, you can see what look like power lines there overhead, which certainly means that it would appear to be at least much closer than the pictures that we've seen so far. To the best of our knowledge, again, the debris has come down in the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area, in eastern Texas, and also in Louisiana. This particular video, I'm just told, has been shot over Waco, Texas. You'll recall, if you've been with us for the last almost 2 hours now, that an eyewitness, a cameraman, a reporter at our local station there in Waco had spotted the Columbia. He was just out to shoot some routine video as the Columbia hurtled by at, as we've said, 12,500 miles an hour. Instead, it looked like it was breaking up. He originally thought that that might be jets accompanying the Space Shuttle Columbia as it came down on its regular path streaking across the southeastern portion of the United States toward Florida. But instead, it now appears almost certain that it was the Space Shuttle Columbia with all 7 astronauts aboard breaking up as they lost contact now almost 2 hours ago. It's coming up on 10:59 on the East Coast, so it was 1 hour and 59 minutes ago. And this is the first video that we've seen, the video that we've seen all along. It was 1 hour and 59 minutes ago that NASA at the Johnson Space Center in Houston lost contact first with the data stream from the Space Shuttle Columbia, then realized that they had lost contact entirely. And as we've been saying, almost simultaneously, the reports of massive explosions, concussions, shaking houses and homes in the Dallas area. We've certainly seen from our reports out of Waco, Texas, that the video may have come, or excuse me, that the debris from the shuttle may have come down around there. And we've gotten some reports that certainly they're concerned about a debris path extending all the way into Louisiana because of the simple fact that the shuttle was some 39 miles up when this massive explosion or malfunction occurred.
It's probably a good time to reiterate and reemphasize for people, as we've heard from Mission Control all morning, that if you do in fact come across any of the debris, for the folks who are in the area affected, to not touch it, not go near it, and then of course call authorities and report it. We have NBC's chief science correspondent Bob Bazell with us.
I'm going to interrupt for just a sec because we've got another eyewitness on the phone right now, Bob Moulter, down in Texas. Bob, can you tell us what you saw about now 2 hours ago?
Well, what happened was the house began to shake very violently, and there was an extremely loud roar. We live very close to a major rail line, and I thought, oh God, there's been an explosion.
Bob, I want to interrupt for a sec. Tell me where exactly you live.
Palestine is located approximately 110 miles southeast of Dallas.
Okay, so 100 and some miles southeast of Dallas, and then, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just continue on now and tell me what you felt and what you saw.
Well, as I say, everything, even the ground was shaking, and I looked up into the sky to see if there was any smoke, like from an explosion, and right above me was a very large smoke plume that was zigzagging. It was making swirls in an S pattern heading directly southeast. And if you've seen the coverage on CNN, magnify the width of that by 10 or 20 times. It was huge. And it moved through. It took about a minute and a half before the noise subsided, and by that time it had gone down towards the horizon, and I lost it into the sun.
So you didn't actually feel the impact of the explosion. What you felt was actually this zigzagging, hurtling piece of debris rushing overhead, and that alone was enough to cause the ground to shake and the house to rattle.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there was a gentleman on before from NASA who was describing sonic booms, and the best way to describe this, because I have heard a sonic boom, was a prolonged sonic boom.
How long, Bob?
I'm going to say approximately a minute and a half.
So for about a minute and a half, and that gave, I mean, you were inside, I take it, at the time. Tell me, what did you do?
Well, when I was inside, I immediately went outside. As I say, the walls were shaking, the windows were rattling. When I went outside, I was like, what's going on? When I looked up, as I say, that's when I saw the plume. And I came back in, called my wife at work to see if she had seen, heard, or felt it. And of course, they were in a brick building. They felt it and they heard it, but they didn't see anything. And I immediately then turned on the local television station. There was nothing. I flipped to CNN, and within a matter of seconds, it came up and said that there was possible problems with the shuttle, and I realized then what had occurred.
Bob Moulter, an eyewitness in Texas, about 100 or so miles southeast of Dallas, who saw this morning. And Bob, just let me make sure that I understand the timing of this. Was this right around 8 a.m. Central Time, 9 a.m. East Coast time?
Yes. I'm going to say it was approximately 8:09 here.
8:09 roughly your time?
Central Time, correct.
Okay, and obviously we don't know whose clocks are right as far as what time exactly it was, but we know from NASA officials that they lost contact at roughly 9 a.m. East Coast time, about 2 hours and 3 minutes ago. And I'm going to let Soledad jump in here.
All right, NBC's Bob Bazell is our chief science correspondent. Bob, thanks for sticking with us as we take some little breaks here. NASA is going to have to go about reconstructing what happened. How do they do that? Is there sort of the equivalent of the black box that we hear about on aircraft on the shuttle?
Well, there's a lot more than that, Soledad. The kind of information that's contained in the black box on an aircraft, which has to do with position and altitude, and is not only stored aboard the shuttle, it's sent down in a constant data stream to the Earth. So one of the things that they could be looking at right away, I'm sure they are looking at it right now, is all the information, which is called the telemetry, that was coming from the spacecraft as it was coming in for its landing to Earth. It all goes into the Johnson Space Center in Houston, which is not far from the area where it seems to have passed over on its way to the ground. So there's an enormous amount of information that will have to be analyzed before they can start taking any kind of guess or beginning the investigation into what went wrong here today. So yeah, possibly something on board could help, although something falling from that kind of speed and that kind of elevation is not likely to be survivable in much of a piece. But we don't know that. We'll just have to wait and see what they find along the ground. Clearly, NASA's emergency plan, they have alerted all the police departments and other emergency responders in the area along that flight path that we've seen on the sky to be looking for pieces of this, to be looking for possible survivors, of course. We should point out that we didn't see any parachutes or anything like that, and that wouldn't be even a possibility at those kind of speeds for somebody to jump out of a moving spacecraft at those kind of speeds at 200,000 feet or 12,000 miles an hour. You would just be killed instantly anyway if you left. So there isn't, a parachute is not a possibility in this situation. So the all of the data will be monitored in intense detail, but there is an enormous amount of data that's taken in continuously from the spacecraft, any of which could provide clues as to what went wrong today. So
in fact, some of the reports we've heard, Bob, talk about how the shuttle was traveling at something like 6 times the speed of sound. So obviously, any kind of parachute or something like that would be virtually impossible. When you talk about telemetry, would that include, again, back to the analogy with aircraft, would that include like a voice recorder? Are they recording what's going on inside the cockpit, essentially, of the shuttle at all times?
I think they are, but I'm not sure to the answer to that question. But there is an enormous amount of recording of data, both the conversations to Earth for the astronauts and information about the speed, the location, and the functioning of but don't forget, these are very complex machines. It's important to point out that Columbia was the first space shuttle to be launched. It was launched in 1981 with a 2-person crew, Bob Crippen and Joe Engle. And a lot of people are saying, well, it's the oldest spacecraft. Should we be concerned about that? In fact, it did go back for extensive renovations so that it became up to the standard of the rest of the fleets. And many astronauts considered it the best of the spacecraft because they just thought of it as more solid. So there's been no indication that because it's the oldest, that would be part of it, although I'm certainly sure that will be part of the investigation as the investigation unfolds.
NBC's chief science correspondent, Robert Bazell. Robert, thanks so much. Let's go to David Gregory at the White House with the latest on the president, who's expected to arrive there in about 55 minutes now. David.
Right, David. He is on his way from Camp David because of the inclement weather and fog. He won't be choppering, but he will be taking a motorcade back. We're hearing from White House officials who are assembled here. The president's senior staff all in place here at the White House now. The president does intend to speak to the nation, but we're told that NASA will address this disaster first, the mechanics of it, what they know, what they've learned. The White House being very firm on this point that NASA will be the first one to address this before the president says anything to the country. Again, the president about an hour away from the White House now. We've also learned that the vice president was in fact in Texas, nowhere near the site of this explosion, but he was hunting this weekend. He has been briefed. He has been in touch with his senior staff officials. He'll monitor the situation. No plans for him to return, given that the president now coming back to the White House. David.
David, when we were told earlier that the president had been notified of this disaster by his chief of staff, Andrew Card, was there any indication that he had received word from NASA directly, or was merely passing on the media reports that something had gone horribly wrong with the space shuttle?
It was a combination, is our understanding, that there was some notification. There were also media reports, obviously, that they began to monitor, and so word was passed on. And they are getting direct information. They're monitoring the situation. As I mentioned, about a half an hour ago, we saw the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, returning to her post here, monitoring any other discussions and there's been some talk about whether there may be a terrorism link. That is nothing but speculation. The White House has not commented on that at all. No doubt they'll explore any avenue here, but for now they are simply taking in this raw information as we are now, and they are going to be very careful about commenting it all publicly until NASA has had a chance to get all the information, to get it right, and to make it public.
NBC's David Gregory at the White House. David, thanks so much. And once again, here's Soledad.
All right, David, thanks very much. For those of you who are just joining us this morning, let's recap what has happened. Approximately 16 minutes before its scheduled landing, the Space Shuttle Columbia lost radio communication with NASA. The shuttle was making its final approach to land. It was over Texas airspace, and it was going to be approaching the Kennedy Space Center. It seems to be no doubt whatsoever that the pictures you're seeing here, these pictures of essentially a mass surrounded by a tail as it plunges across and then down to the ground, is indeed pictures of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Up until about 9 a.m. Eastern Time, when the shuttle lost communications with NASA, it seemed to be virtually a perfect mission. The weather was excellent. The scientific research mission had gone very well over the past 16 days. Back on January 16th, the takeoff had perfect weather as well. There were some 80 experiments completed on board. Essentially, NASA said the entire mission was routine and uneventful. Well, now NASA is instituting its contingency plans. They have search and rescue teams on the ground around Dallas, Fort Worth area, any area where they think some of the debris from the Space Shuttle Columbia may have in fact fallen to the ground. Jay Barbary is continuing to stand by for us. Jay, what are you being told right now from the folks at NASA?
Well, we're hoping that there will be a news conference here at the Kennedy Space Center at 11:30. That's one report we're getting. That will be carried on NASA TV, and we'll all be able to watch it. Maybe we'll get a little more information. The shuttle was traveling at a speed of 12,500 miles per hour, 39 miles above Central Texas, when whatever happened. There's little doubt left that it was Columbia that we've been seeing in all of these pictures breaking up and coming back. No reports yet on what are really solid speculation on what could have gone wrong, but it could have been many things, and they're trying to put their fingers on it now. They're going back looking at all their tracking data previous to the time that the catastrophe took place. So hopefully we'll get a little more information, Soledad, in about another 20 minutes here when they have the news conference.
Well, Jay, you say many things could have gone wrong, but really up to this point, up till when contact was lost, it seemed like the mission was going perfectly. Some people have pointed to the auxiliary power units as a potential area of concern. First, tell me exactly what those are, what they do, and why potentially could they be an issue?
Well, these power units, there are 3 of them in the shuttle. They fire them up during the takeoff, and they fire them up before landing. What they do, they power the control surfaces on the shuttle itself, the elevons, the rudder, and everything that controls the flight coming back in. At 39 miles up, you're just entering the upper portions of the atmosphere. Space begins at 60 miles up. So you're in some atmosphere at 60 miles. You're beginning at 40 miles up, getting to the area where these control units on the shuttle itself will take over in the atmosphere and keep the shuttle on course like an airplane. And at that point, you turn off your rocket thrusters that you use in space where you have no air to keep control of this spacecraft. So they think this is what happened somewhere in that area when they're switching control. Now, if one of these power units had come apart, just literally come apart, it could have thrown pieces all over the shuttle, tearing it up, depressurizing it, taking out communications, actually destroying the shuttle up there. Or if you had lost an elevon, any control unit, then the shuttle could have started coming down again, and they couldn't have got it under control. It could have started breaking up. You would not have had any communications with the ground. There are so many things that could have happened at that time, and anything that we're talking about now is pure speculation.
But these are all things, of course, Jay, that NASA will be investigating and looking into over the next several days and weeks and months as this investigation moves forward, right?
Right, that's correct, Soledad.
Jay, I don't want to belabor this point, but I think it's worth repeating the danger for people who might be in Texas, might be in Louisiana. We are looking right now at this shot, which is a comparatively new piece of video for us, taken in Waco, Texas, as the remnants, it certainly appears that way, of the Space Shuttle Columbia streaked across the Earth and streaked, as you can see, down from some 39 miles up to make their catastrophic explosions on the ground. What we're being told by NASA, and what the point that you have made quite emphatically, is if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where we know there have been reports of some explosions, or at least certainly that sonic boom that we're hearing people talk about, if you're in East Texas, and we've heard from Palestine and Waco and various locales in Texas, even if you're in Louisiana, which was on the Space Shuttle flight, if you're which we're looking at right now, if you're anywhere near where that debris might have come down, you've got to get away from that as fast as possible, right?
That is correct, David. We cannot emphasize that enough. Excuse me. We cannot emphasize that enough that if you get there and you're able to breathe any of this fuel, it can literally form a membrane over the oxygen sacs in your lungs, and you can suffocate within 48 hours. So don't touch it, don't breathe it, don't go near it, stay away from it, make sure everybody else does, and let the experts come in. and make sure the area is clear for them to inspect, in which they will. Longer it stays on the ground, the more the fuel will dissipate, and the likelihood of danger decreases. But you don't know. You don't know if it's still hovering in that area. You do not want to breathe it.
Jay, talk about how the Space Shuttle Columbia would have been tracked this morning. Now it's been 2 hours and 15 minutes since NASA lost contact with Columbia. Obviously, no doubt now that these are pictures of Columbia breaking up from some catastrophic malfunction or catastrophic explosion. As NASA is tracking it, would they be able to watch on their satellite monitors as it actually breaks apart? And would they be able to pinpoint it landed here, it landed here, it landed here, or is it not that precise?
No, it is not that precise where it was at the time, because what they had at the time was that they had telemetry data coming in. These are numbers that they gives them the information of what's going on with the different systems. Now, the tracking radar was located here at the Kennedy Space Center on Merritt Island, Florida. It skin tracks it as it comes in. They did not pick up anything. It wasn't close enough for these radars here to pick it up. Radars in, for example, one of the best radar units that we have is up at Eglin Air Force Base in the Panhandle. Whether they were watching it coming in, I don't know. Possibly they could have seen something from Eglin Air Force Base in the Panhandle of Florida. I don't know of any other radar units that would have been on the shuttle at this time. If they had skin tracking, they could have seen it breaking up, but I don't know if they had skin tracking or not. There's also satellites in orbit that we could have been watching it with, that they can go back and they can see if they see anything on that, because we have a good system of satellites up there that we know what's going on, and we track different things, and their trigger, if you see something like an explosion or fire or something, there are satellites up there that are looking for nuclear explosions, for example, at any time. So we may be able to go back to our spy satellites and pick up something there. Don't know. It's a possibility. But at the time, Mission Control would have no reason to be skin tracking this, because it would be coming across Texas and they would be getting their data, which, as I said, is in numbers, and it's coming down, and they're watching it there on their consoles within the Mission Control Center. So they did not pick it up at the radar center here on Merritt Island, Florida. It wasn't close enough yet. Whether they got it at Eglin Air Force Base is another question.
And Jay, it's certainly worth taking a look at that imagery from NASA of the track that the Space Shuttle Columbia was scheduled to have been on, because unlike previous missions, in fact, as they're coming in, landing in Florida, or scheduled to land in Florida, it would have been above the United States, not over water, but above the United States at all times.
Right, and it would be right over Eglin Air Force Base.
Exactly.
So with it coming in, it's a possibility that Eglin may have seen it. If they were looking, they probably could have seen it. Whether or not they were looking is the question.
NBC's Jay Barbary, I know that you'll continue to work your contacts at NASA, and in the meantime, let's go back to Soledad.
NBC's Jim McLefchesky is standing by for us at the Pentagon. Mick, earlier we heard that the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs have convened a domestic event conference. First and foremost, what exactly is that?
Well, rather than that, if I could, to follow up with what David and Jay were talking about, the possibility that some other spy satellites could have detected any anomaly, any catastrophe aboard the Columbia. Sources tell us here at the Pentagon that, in fact, one U.S. military satellite that, as Jay mentioned, is designed to keep an eye on the Earth's surface to see if there are any kind of extraordinary missile launches in some country somewhere, or, as Jay said, a nuclear explosion. We are told now that one of those satellites, in fact, detected what is called a heat spike. In other words, they're keeping their eye on the screen, and suddenly there's a flash which could indicate an explosion of some kind. And this satellite, we're told, detected a heat flash in the very vicinity on the flight path of Columbia at about the same time that NASA would have lost communications.
So that satellite detected something on the ground having an explosion?
No, what these satellites are designed to do is keep an eye on the Earth's surface to see if there are any unusual flashes of light, heat sources, like, for example, a missile test, a missile launch, an explosion of some kind, like a nuclear test. Well, what they did is they saw this flash. They can detect these heat sources in the air also. And so what they did apparently detected at about the time that Columbia's communication went black on the same flight path as Columbia, they detected in the air what is called a heat spike, which indicates there was probably an explosion of some kind.
All right, I understand that now. Thanks for clearing that up.
Right.
The Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs, as I mentioned, are convening this domestic event conference. Is that typical? What exactly is that, and who does that involve?
Well, essentially, it's a crisis team that immediately is gathered together to deal with any kind of. This is the domestic crisis, of course, and since there's no indication, and people we talk to here at the Pentagon stress that there's no indication of any kind of outside source, any kind of foul play that could have been involved in what occurred with the Columbia today. So the domestic team, as we understand it, is gathering at the White House, and apparently, according to Rosalind Jordan, I hear that the president will probably be coming back from Camp David to the White House and could participate in that later today. Now, what the U.S. military may be involved with, there has been no specific request directly to the Pentagon for any kind of support in any search and rescue. However, there are military units that are tasked during any Columbia flight or any shuttle flight. You'll remember back during the Challenger catastrophe, there were assets in the air, helicopters and planes, and there were satellites tracking the course of the Challenger, and they were able to respond immediately. What's at question here is whether there were any U.S. military assets in the air at the time of the Columbia incident today, and it's likely that they probably were not. Any assets would have probably been in the air closer to the actual touchdown site at Cape Canaveral. But we do know that Space Command, Strategic Command, NORAD, and of course Northern Command, this new command that was put together after 9/11, are all now involved in attempting to put together some kind of search and rescue effort, although it's probably more search than rescue at this point.
Jim, as we look at this video, and we have two different angles thus far of what appears to be the debris from the Space Shuttle Columbia falling to Earth roughly 2 hours and 22 minutes ago, around the time that NASA lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. And this is the second view of that, streaking across the sky. This shot taken from Waco, Texas, from our affiliate there in Waco, Texas. Jim, when you talk about all these different centers potentially to provide search and rescue, but also potentially, like this military satellite, watching the Columbia as it goes in for its landing, how quickly are they going to be able to assess the impact area and say, if you're living in this part of Texas or this part of Louisiana, you're in the danger zone? Because right now we're sort of issuing this broad band warning, but don't know what the debris field is.
According to the early reports that I've heard, the debris field is quite extensive, and given the speed and distance traveled by the Columbia as it was breaking apart here, you clearly see in the video, and one military expert I talked to here said that so far they have no indication, as I said earlier, of any kind of external interference. In other words, anything that happened with the Columbia appeared at this point to have been internal. They did watch this the shuttle as it streaked across the sky, and they said it was quite telling as you saw the pieces break off that the shuttle was disintegrating. But at this point, the search and rescue efforts I would venture to guess at this point, since the military would have had no concentrated search and rescue apparatus in place across North Texas, that most of the search and rescue that is going to be involved at this point will probably involve local law enforcement.
Jim, let me ask you a question about that, because obviously we've talked a great deal since September 11th about local first responders and the dangers that they face. Additionally, today, we've been talking about the dangers from this toxic jet fuel. Jay Barbary, as well as NASA officials, making the point that it could be lethal within a matter of a day or two to anyone coming into any sort of close contact with this brown cloud, as Jay Barbary has described it. how concerned are officials at the Pentagon who have these very, very highly trained first responders that instead, as is always the case, what you're going to have is local cops, local police officers, local paramedics, and frankly, local citizens on the scene?
Well, there has been, there has been extensive training of local law enforcement agencies ever since 9/11, but obviously probably not enough. And that has been one of the concerns of the people in the Pentagon, that if there were a catastrophic event, now they were talking primarily, of course, about terrorist events, whether it involved weapons of mass destruction, chem, bio, radiological devices. Their concern, of course, was that local law enforcement, or even the general public, is probably not as well informed as they would like. However, they feel fairly confident that there has been enough training in concentration at the higher levels of law enforcement agencies throughout the country, and enough public warnings about the possibilities of chemical, biological, or radiological attacks in the United States, that they have concern, but they feel, I believe, fairly confident that local law enforcement is already up to speed on how to react to these. And I think NASA should be commended. Even before they officially declared this as an explosion, an accident, possible fatalities, they put out the alert very quickly that anybody coming in contact with any of this debris should stay away, because of the horrific consequences that we heard are possible from Jay Barbary.
NBC's Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon. Jim, thanks so much. Let's go back now to Buzz Aldrin, the longtime astronaut who's in Los Angeles and who can bring us up to date on what he's hearing. Buzz, can you hear me yet?
Yes, I can.
Buzz,
good morning.
Good morning to you. You've now had a chance to see some of this video, which we've been watching firsthand, the different angles of what we now know without a doubt is the space shuttle plummeting to Earth, the debris from some sort of massive explosion or malfunction. What goes through your mind? What are you thinking about as you watch this?
Well, it's a very sad day. It's going to go down in history along with the Apollo fire and the Challenger accident. There have been losses like this by the Russians, and I'm sure they're as sensitive to these events as we are and the rest of the world is. I just hope that we're able to discover in a short period of time what the most likely cause of this is, so that we can set about trying to get moving on the corrective action that would be needed to get the shuttle fleet back going again. We have 3 human beings up at the space station right now, and I'm sure that plans are being considered as to what their disposition will be, depending on how long the shuttle fleet may be grounded. Of course, the entire world is very sensitive right now to the families and to all those close to the crew members who were apparently lost on this tragic accident.
Buzz, let's talk about that for a moment. We've mentioned that there were 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia when it lost contact with NASA at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, roughly 2.5 hours ago. We know that their families were taken almost immediately to an undisclosed location there at Cape Canaveral, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking at the pictures right now of Rick Husband, the commander of the Space Shuttle, and the other members of the Space Shuttle. There's William McCool, who was the pilot, 41-year-old pilot, David Brown, one of the mission specialists, and the other members, Michael Anderson, another mission specialist, age 43, Kalpana Chawla, also a mission specialist, and also Laurel Clark. And in addition to that, the first Israeli astronaut ever, Ilan Ramon, a payload specialist, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. As we think about their fate, and also, as you mentioned, the fate of those 3 astronauts who are currently aboard the Space Shuttle, and you mentioned a point that is certainly worth mentioning, which is that there's no doubt that the shuttle fleet will now be grounded. How quickly can an investigation like this proceed, and how quickly do they need to get back to those astronauts in space?
Well, I'm sure we have all the talent of NASA, if not in Florida right now. They'll be en route there and gathering around to assemble all the possible data that they can to make the timely decisions as to what to do. The astronaut and cosmonauts up at the space station do have a Soyuz spacecraft that is a crew emergency return vehicle that they can come back at any time. But I think as many past events in space would testify, it's best not to rush into drastic decisions. There's nothing wrong with the space station right now. There's no need for any drastic action. There may be supply capabilities available through the Progress resupply ships, but I feel certain that the crew in the space station will have to come down before another fully assembled crew would go back up again, because that would probably be on the next shuttle flight. We have replaced the crew return vehicle last November, and the next cycle for it to be replaced will be in April. So they may send up a fresh Soyuz spacecraft before having the crew that's on board the space station right now, committing them to return in the Soyuz that's up there. Well, so much for the space station. There are many people who will be looking at that situation, and of course the entire nation is going to be looking very closely at the southeastern United States and the areas where there may be portions of the Space Shuttle Columbia, and I think everyone has been warned to stay very clear of those locations so that they can avoid any hazardous material, but also so that the investigation can continue in a very straightforward way.
Former astronaut Buzz Aldrin, American hero, speaking to us on this most heart-wrenching of days. Just to repeat, it was 2 hours and 32 minutes ago that NASA lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski at the White House has reported that a U.S. military satellite noted a heat spike at roughly that same moment that we now believe was the catastrophic explosion or malfunction aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. Certainly no indication that any of the 7 astronauts on board somehow survived that horrendous event. It was almost instantaneously that camera crews in Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in the Palestine area, in Waco, Texas, started to record the video that you're seeing here, the debris of the Space Shuttle Columbia hurtling to Earth. It had been traveling at 12,500 miles an hour at roughly 39 miles up in the sky. So a wide debris field, very dangerous for anyone in that vicinity of Texas or Louisiana. Right now, we're going to turn it over to NBC's Brian Williams to continue our coverage. For Soledad O'Brien, I'm David Bloom in New York. Good day.
And David, thank you, as America now has another tragic piece of videotape that will no doubt be repeated throughout this day and in the days to come, the apparent disintegration of the space shuttle right about at the center portion of the state of Texas. We are going to go to NBC News White House correspondent David Gregory, who has just emerged from the West Wing with more information. David?
Brian, I've been speaking to White House officials who say that at the moment, with the senior staff assembled here at the White House, they are fully investigating any scenario that might involve terrorism, anything beyond a mechanical catastrophe. But officials telling NBC News at this point, there is no reason to believe that terrorism or any foul play was involved with this unfolding disaster. The president is now approximately a half an hour away from the White House. He was at the presidential retreat of Camp David. He will, we're told, speak to the nation at some point today. He, within the past hour, has been in touch with the head head of NASA, Sean O'Keefe, his chief of staff, Andy Card, has also spoken with Mr. O'Keefe. They are monitoring the situation. They're getting all the latest information as NASA sorts through all of their available information and prepares to brief the country themselves. The president will not speak until NASA briefs the country with all the information that it has. There has certainly been a lot of discussion about the fact that among the astronauts, the first ever from Israel. We're told by officials that government officials, administration officials, have been in touch with their counterparts in the Israeli government. The president has not yet called Prime Minister Sharon. That is a judgment that has been made. That call has not been made yet. We also know that Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, has also been very active talking to local officials in Texas and Louisiana. There is a huge public safety component to be coordinated as NASA tries to figure out what happened on the ground with falling debris that is very dangerous. People should stay away from it, NASA says. It's important that the White House coordinate through Homeland Security with local officials to make sure that people stay away from that area and that effort is mobilized. So again, the president is on his way back. He learned about this earlier this morning from his chief of staff, Andy Card. He does intend to speak to the nation at some point today after NASA gets more information. But again, Brian, it bears repeating that while an investigation of every scenario goes on with the senior staff assembled here at the White House, the president's chief political advisor, Karl Rove, his press staff, the national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and his chief of staff. While that investigation on every front continues, administration officials saying there is no reason to believe at this point that terrorism or any other act of foul play is involved. The president has been in touch directly with the head of NASA as he continues to monitor these events. Brian.
David, as you point out, the huge difference between what apparently is a national tragedy and what could have been a national emergency of some kind. It also bears repeating the FBI not at all involved in this. Intelligence officials say they noticed nothing untoward prior to launch, at the time of launch, or all morning this morning prior to this. Perhaps you can go back over the president's schedule these past 12 hours. They were supposed to go to Camp David, the President and Prime Minister Blair, yesterday, but that was put off, correct?
It was, because of the weather we have down here, rain and fog. It's not ideal conditions to travel by helicopter to Camp David, which, as you know, is about an hour away in the Maryland mountains. So the president getting word of this morning. He was spending the weekend at Camp David and has come back via limousine, via his motorcade. And as I say, he's about a half an hour out or so after first talking with his chief of staff, Andy Card. So certainly monitoring the media coverage of this and talking directly to NASA. Again, it bears repeating, the administration stressing that while so much information is out there, there's so much that is not known at this point. The president fully intends to address the American people, but not until more information can be shared, more conclusions can be drawn about what is an unfolding catastrophe. Brian.
David Gregory from the White House lawn this morning. And again, this president will be forced to calm an entire nation. We do expect the president to speak at some point today, again, pending confirmation of a lot of the information that is out there. We expect the president to take to the airwaves and address the nation at some point when the White House feels it would be necessary and appropriate. We have no official confirmation of death of the 7 astronauts on board the Shuttle Columbia, which, if you're just joining us, was making its 28th flight in a 22-year-long program, 113 flights in all. And apparently broke up at around 200,000 feet at around Mach 6, would put it roughly at 12,000 miles an hour over central Texas. And as David Bloom pointed out, camera crews for miles around rushed to get the best vantage point. And as people join our coverage throughout the day, perhaps hearing the worst, there is at least one New York radio station with a live reporter in Midtown Manhattan interviewing people about the possibility of terrorism. That is, by all accounts and according to all the evidence, absolutely not the case here. This appears to be a catastrophic system failure on the shuttle itself and not the work of any foreign hands that would do any harm to the space shuttle astronauts. Jay Barbary, our veteran correspondent who has covered every manned space mission this nation has launched, is with us from the Cape by telephone. Jay, what can you add to the reporting so far?
Well, Brian, you pretty well covered it. We're waiting right now for a news conference to be held here at the Kennedy Space Center. It could be coming up any time. They first estimated 11:30. Now they're trying to get everybody together, and it could happen in the next 5 minutes or the hour, or within an hour, I should say. All that they know at this time is that everything was on course. Everything was going perfectly. The shuttle Columbia was speeding at 12,500 miles per hour, 39 miles above Central Texas when this catastrophe took place. So there's little doubt left that the Columbia has been lost, that the crew has been lost, and that we have tracking video of it coming down over East Texas and possibly into Louisiana. And as you said earlier, Brian, it is essential that if anybody finds any of this debris to stay away from it because of the rocket fuel on board. It's called hypergolic fuel, which simply means it's oxidizer and the fuel on contact ignites. But more importantly, if you breathe it, it will set up oxygen membrane over the oxygen sacs in your lungs, and you could suffocate from it within 48 hours. So please stay away from it. Keep everybody away from it. And now they're going back over all their tracking information, trying to pin down what happened, to get some handle on what could have happened here at the place on the reentry, Brian, where it was leaving space and the Columbia was becoming an airplane. Space begins at 60 miles up. It was at approximately 40 miles. It had gotten enough into the atmosphere that they were beginning to use the flight control systems for the atmosphere on board the shuttle. They had turned off their attitude control thruster rockets, and it was at this point with the auxiliary power units running full speed and everything happening as they became an airplane, and apparently something went wrong.
Now, Jay, you mentioned aircraft as opposed to spacecraft. It would probably be a good time to talk about the notion of the black box that so many Americans have become familiar with commercial and other aircraft. Is it not true that in the space business there is a constant real-time live streaming black box in effect on the ground? That is to say, all those people we are familiar seeing at all those control panels are looking at all the incoming data, and is it not further possible to say that they could know, there could be someone now who has a fairly good idea which system failed primarily?
That is true, Brian. You're looking at the black box when you look at mission control. When you see all those guys sitting in there, all of that information on all the systems within the shuttle is being transmitted down by data through the TDRS satellite back down to mission control. They are looking at it. The only indication we got was before they lost communications with the crew, they lost some sensors. I have been trying to find out what sensors, but no one seems to know from the Public Affairs Office or the people that I can talk to. Other sources are, of course, within looking at the data now. So perhaps in this news conference coming up, we can get a little bit more information on this. But there are systems, of course, recorders on board, but the likelihood that spacecraft or now an aircraft traveling at 12,500 miles per hour coming through the atmosphere, it's very hard to believe that anything would be left. But they are going over their tracking data, and we also mentioned about the spy satellites up there. We would have some information on some of the systems that would be picking up what went on. If there was an explosion, if they would have a heat spike that they would be picking up, and then they would know from that at what time it occurred. But most of the information, Brian, is there, just like it was there on Challenger. They suspected different things at different times on Challenger. First, the suspect was it was an engine that gave loose, but it turned out to be one of the O-rings on, I believe, the right-hand booster. Yes, it was a right-hand booster. But because when the shuttle took off, Challenger took off, it rotated 180 degrees and put the solid rocket booster north of all the cameras. It wasn't until NASA went and got its cameras from the north side of the beach that they saw this plume of smoke take place. They saw the eruption of the flame coming between the field joint splice of the right solid booster rocket, and then they knew 2 days afterwards what had happened. It took them another 3 months to prove that's what happened, but they really knew what had happened 2 days later. So this is the type of thing that they're going to go into now with the information that they have, and they will start systematically pinpointing what possibly went wrong on Columbia, and they will try to find it. Now, we've had estimates by different experts that projected the likelihood of a catastrophe with the shuttle, with all of those thousands of parts that they have to monitor, that being one about every 75 flights. Well, this was the 113th flight of a shuttle, and now apparently we've lost 2. So that gives them some projection, idea where we are there. But they will be able to pin down precisely with the information that they have what went wrong here. It will probably take days, if not weeks, or possibly months.
We're on the phone with our veteran correspondent, Jay Barbary. And Jay, about the media coverage of the space program these days, we got serious again after the disaster in '86, but we've gone back into one of those periods of being almost cavalier, certainly blasé about covering launches and landings. You see some videotape on some newscast, you know vaguely that there's a shuttle in the air or not. But this, of course, will, for all the wrong reasons, send us back again. I know you continue to cover every launch and landing, whether or not we air it extensively or not. Was this launch completely normal?
It was the most normal launch we've had in a long time. I commented to the crew on top of the building, Brian, I can't remember a more perfect condition for a launch. Generally, as you know, we have a 3-story building at Press Site 39 here that overlooks the launch pads, and every mission we're up there with our cameras trained on the launches. And as you said, we go on the air most of the time with the launches, and I can't remember when the conditions were any better. There were no clouds in the sky. There were absolutely nothing, no wind, had no problem with anything. It was just a gorgeous launch, one of the best launches. And the mission was that. We had no problems with the mission. The only problem that they had, the dehumidifiers on board were not working as well as they expected, and they had to keep some of the cabin part as well as the space lab part where the astronauts were and the experiments were. They had to keep it at 80 degrees. They couldn't get it down to 70 degrees where they wanted it, but that was the only thing that they had. Everything went just by the book. And in fact, the deorbit burn was by the book this morning. They were on course. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. And then all of a sudden, we lost communications with the astronauts. Well, nobody got really shook up about that because it happens. The shuttle can be out of position with its antennas, and you pick them back up a little bit later. But then the guys at Mission Control noticed no data. So then they got excited, and we went on the air because we should have seen on the radar here at Merritt Island, we should have seen the shuttle coming in. We've got these long-range cameras that can see the heat far away, the infrared cameras. Columbia wasn't there. So now we know, I don't think there's any question left, that Columbia suffered a catastrophe 39 miles over central Texas, moving at 12,500 miles per hour, and the debris field can be quite large. It can extend into Louisiana.
Jay, we're going to ask you to stand by. We're going to need your advice, coverage, and counsel throughout the day, especially given your vast experience on this story and this subject. This is going to call the attention of every adult who was alive and aware back in 1986. back to the last time the nation suffered such a tragedy, if what we fear to be apparent here is true, and this has been a catastrophic loss of spacecraft and all those on board. We recall the story of Krista McAuliffe, all the other astronauts on board the Challenger. The family members of the crew of Columbia were today, as is the custom, given VIP treatment, escorted into the Kennedy Space Center today, again anticipating a safe reunion with their loved ones at the end of the landing strip. This is the very customary looking NASA shuttle bus that is used to ferry VIPs, government officials, family, back and forth there at the Space Center. They made a very hasty retreat at one point when the worst was feared, and the families have now been quarantined by NASA as they, along with the rest of us, await any kind of official word excuse me, about what has happened here. We want to go to an eyewitness, a gentleman who's been very patient with us as we've taken a good while to get him on the telephone. Bob Multer is a resident of Palestine, Texas. Bob, first of all, put your location on the map for us. Where are you in the state of Texas?
Brian, we're approximately 110 miles southeast of Dallas, 100 miles directly east of Waco.
And Bob, where were you? What did you see?
Well, actually, I was sitting in the living room having some coffee, and all of a sudden there was an extremely loud explosion type of a sound, and the entire house began to shake. And we live very close to a major rail line. I thought, oh my God, there's been an explosion. So I walked out front, looked towards the direction of the railroad. There was nothing there, and so I started to look in the sky, and right above me was this huge plume of smoke, which was in a zigzag or a spiraling type of motion, headed directly towards the southeast. And of course the noise continued, and it was very, very loud, and the shaking the ground, you could feel the ground shake. And I thought, something's wrong here. So I called my wife at work to ask if she had seen, heard, or felt anything. And they're in a solid brick building. They heard it. The building shook there as well. However, of course, being inside, they didn't see anything. And one of her coworkers said, oh, that's just the shuttle flying over. And I said, I don't think so. So I came in and turned on the local news. There was nothing there. I switched over to CNN, and within a matter of moments, it came up as breaking news, and then I was aware of what I had just witnessed.
So, Bob, has the shuttle, periodic shuttle flights, have they become a part of life? Are you used to sonic booms? You're aware of it on days when it's supposed to come overhead for a landing, perhaps?
Quite honestly, no, Brian. I was not aware that the shuttle was due to go over us today, and I have seen on the news before where they've announced, at a certain time you can see the shuttle in the night sky or whatever, but I was not aware of it today.
And you're familiar with the videotape, obviously, of the Challenger. When you looked up, was this mostly one piece, a central piece of debris that you saw in the zigzag pattern?
No, sir.
So there were several?
No, there were several. All of the coverage that has been shown so far indicated, of course, there was some breakup as shown on television. Mm-hmm. But normally when you see a vapor trail from a high-flying jet or whatever, it's in a straight line, and it's a fairly narrow straight line. This, you can magnify the coverage you've seen on television 10, 15 times at least. It was so wide, and as I say, in such an erratic pattern, and it disappeared into the sun. I lost it then.
Any evidence that where you are is a debris field? Have you heard even anecdotally of people who have seen anything?
Yes, we have been hearing from the local affiliates here that excuse me, that was a call coming in.
Oh, sure.
That debris has been located in the Lufkin-Nacogdoches area, which is approximately 48 miles southeast of us.
This would be a real good time for the viewers who will be joining us throughout the day. If you're with us from that south central portion of the United States, we can't stress this enough. The warning went up from NASA immediately that should you come upon what looks to be a piece of debris from this, that because of the fuel involved and a whole other set of reasons, don't go near it. Certainly don't make physical contact with it. We've been joined by Bob Moulter, an eyewitness to this from Palestine, Texas, there in the eastern central part of the state of Texas. Mr. Moulter, thank you for your patience, and thank you for sharing your eyewitness account. There is a Pentagon angle to this today, only because when people first heard the word, there were, of course, initial fears and jitters that this might be the result of something else aside from a systemic catastrophic failure on board the shuttle itself. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski is with us for what he's learning from there. Jim?
Brian, first of all, Pentagon officials stress that there's no indication that there was any external factor that would have contributed to what happened aboard the Columbia. And in fact, they point out that at the altitude and speed at which the Challenger was traveling, that there are no organizations, terrorist or otherwise, and even militaries who could actually intercept and try to shoot down the Challenger, the Columbia, the space shuttle. So they are putting to rest any speculation that there was anybody out there who had the ability to shoot down the Columbia. As to what happened on board, of course, that's all open to speculation. But again, no indication that it's anything other than an accident. Also, we're told that at the time that the shuttle was streaking across North Texas, that one of the U.S. military spy satellites, it's essentially an early warning satellite that keeps track, keeps a look down on the Earth to detect any kind of missile launches or explosions. It could be a nuclear test somewhere. And it was this satellite, we're told, that detected a heat spike at about the same time and in the same vicinity as the Columbia was when the apparent accident occurred. There's no analysis yet of the data as far as we know, but there is an indication, at least from one U.S. military satellite apparently, that there was an explosion on board. As far as any kind of search and rescue, the only search and rescue helicopters, planes that would have been in the air at the time would have only been around the landing site, the recovery site there in Florida, or when the shuttles take off. So there were no U.S. military planes or helicopters in the North Texas area. And we're told that just a few minutes ago in this domestic conference that's underway to deal with this tragedy, that it's been pretty much decided that any cleanup, rescue, any kind of recovery efforts will probably now be turned over to FEMA. They'll be the coordinating agency in an attempt to gather up some of this hazardous material that you've been talking about. Most of the activity as of now, however, is at the local and state agencies. There is some thought that if the U.S. military was needed, that the governors in Texas and Louisiana may call up the National Guard, but there's no indication of that as of yet. As far as the U.S. military, its involvement in this is now being conducted by the North American Command out there in Colorado. This was the command that was created after 9/11. It's essentially a combination of several of the U.S. military organizations, NORAD, Space Command, Strategic Command, to engage in homeland protection from external forces. But at this point, they're getting involved directly in trying to piece together exactly what happened and to help in any way that they can the recovery of any of the hazardous debris that has fallen to the earth in North Texas and Louisiana. Brian?
And Jim, isn't it interesting? I'm sure it's not lost on you. Back in '86, when we lost the Challenger, the Pentagon did not come to mind instantly. We would not think of the Department of Defense in this, and it was the first thing that came to mind today to a lot of people.
Well, interestingly, in the Challenger explosion, I was here in the Pentagon, and I walked into an office here in the building, and the generals already had the maps spread out and were plotting the search and rescue efforts that were already underway instantaneously. But again, that was on liftoff. So those assets are in place on liftoff and during recovery because it's felt that if there were an accident would occur, just like an airliner, it may happen, it's most likely to happen then. Nobody obviously was anticipating this, so there would have been no U.S. military assets in the air in that region.
Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon, where he will remain gathering information for us all day. Mick, thank you for that.
Okay, Brian.
Our next guest uttered the words magnificent desolation when he set his foot on the moon. Second man ever to do so as part of the crew of Apollo 11. Buzz Armstrong is with us from our Los Angeles Bureau. Oh, boy. There, I just merged the first and second Americans to set foot on the moon. You'll forgive me, Buzz Aldrin, for saying that. He's with us from our Los Angeles Bureau. And Buzz, can you expand on a point we were discussing with Jay Barbary? The steady stream of data that is sent back from this spacecraft really makes up a live, real-time equivalent of a commercial aircraft black box, correct?
That's right, it does. Until there is a loss of external communication, and of course the black box on board aircraft continues to record the control system positions and many other parameters on board right up to the point of the loss of power supply. And the same is true with the voice recorder, that if communication with the outside world is lost, the voice recorder continues to record what is going on in the cabin, independent of contact with the outside world, until the power supply to that voice recorder is terminated.
And Buzz, I don't want to get ghoulish here, but at this altitude, roughly 200,000 feet at this speed, roughly Mach 6, what's the heat level? What pieces, how much of the aircraft can survive?
Not any significant parts of the craft can survive. It would be fragments. The crew compartment, the pressure vessel, has an integrity that I think was demonstrated in the Challenger accident, that when a nearby catastrophic explosion took place, many portions of the shuttle came apart in pieces, but the crew pressure vessel, the crew cabin, did remain its integrity. On re-entry, the forces are considerably different for a prolonged period of time, and the heat load, depending on where in re-entry, is very considerable. So I don't think that once something began to come apart, that there are very many seconds of survivability left. The question is what kind of anticipation warning might the crew have had that things were going from bad to worse.
Buzz, we've never obviously had an incident on landing with this spacecraft before. You and I have spoken in the past about the project you've been interested in, kind of an alternative to the space shuttle, a different kind of space travel. Talk for a moment, if you will, about the viability. Here we are, 113 missions into the space shuttle program after all.
Well, the shuttle is always being examined very, very closely for any potential wear or deterioration of its performance, and there is an entire program devoted to shuttle upgrades. And I just was in Washington recently speaking to General Mike Kostelnik about the long-range shuttle upgrade programs to prolong the life of the shuttle up through 2020 or beyond. A number of alternative proposals have been made as the shuttle goes through a maturing process. There's always been a consideration for whether an ejectable pod could be part of the upgrade that could contain the crew members as a more positive survivable mode than ejection seats. Ejection seats will only really work in the lower atmosphere and when the crew is protected after ejection. from other very life-threatening devices.
And the whole theory
Upgrading
only
this-
works when you have enough time to have warning, correct?
Well, yes, but warning conditions can be built into the reaction, just like airbags for automobiles that react far faster than any human being could react to the onset of impact.
All right, Buzz Aldrin, who is these days the author of several best-selling books and, as you heard, a consultant on these projects, but of course best known. Sure.
Could I make a mention? I know I tried to mention this to the people covering this particular flight before it was launched, and it has to do with the presence of an Israeli astronaut on board. I'd like to remind the people that in 1985, before the launch of the Challenger, we did fly, as part of our Citizens in Space program, a Saudi prince who was a F-15 pilot, Prince Sultan. And he flew, of course, very successfully. And our entire program has been one, up to the Challenger accident, of exposing international passengers to the opportunities that we have.
A good point. I'm glad you added that. Buzz Aldrin from our Los Angeles Bureau. Thanks. We're going to go back to our correspondent, Jay Barbary. It's important for us to remember, Jay, the people who made up this crew, and perhaps for those Americans, again, who haven't been following the space program, aren't conversant with the backgrounds and biographies of these crew members, you could go through them for us.
Okay, Brian, Rick Husband, he's 45 years old, a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. This was his second flight. He flew back in December 1994 on STS-96. This was STS-107, and Rick was at the controls when they were coming in. He was the commander of the flight, and he's a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. Sitting in the right seat was Willie C. McCool. He's 40 years old, a commander in the U.S. Navy. Of course, he's a former test pilot also. He was a rookie. This was his first flight. And the payload commander was Michael P. Anderson. Michael is a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He's 42 years old, and he flew before on STS-89 in 1998, which was the 8th Shuttle Mir docking mission. Anderson had logged over 211 hours in space before he went up. Mission Specialist 1 was David M. Brown, 46, a captain in the Navy. He's a naval aviator also. And this was his first space flight. He was a rookie. Another veteran on board was born in India. Her name is Kalpana Chawla, spelled a little different, spelled Kalpana Chawla, pronounced Kalpana Chawla. Because they had trouble with it, most crew members called her KC. This was her second flight, and she was Mission Specialist 2. Mission Specialist 4 was Laura Blair Salton Clark. Now, Laura Clark, 41, a commander in the U.S. Navy, she was making her first flight on board this 16-day experiment flight on board Columbia. Now, I want also to remind people that Columbia did not go to the International Space Station. It's the first flight in a couple of years that has gone up of a shuttle that didn't visit the International Space Station. The other crew member on board was the first Israeli astronaut. His name is Ilan Ramon. He's a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. He's a fighter pilot, and he was a payload specialist on this mission. We've heard a lot about him, and he's been training for 2 years to get up there. But those were the 7 people on board Columbia, Brian.
Jay, before I get to another guest who's been patient enough to wait for us, I have one question, and that is that when you come into contact with any member of NASA, any one of the astronauts, they are, as a rule, such impressive individuals. Spend a moment to tell us about the character required and the kind of swagger and bravery that is commonplace, everyday stuff to these folks.
Well, my friend Tom Wolfe wrote a book called The Right Stuff, and that pretty well put it in perspective. The original 7 astronauts, the Mercury astronauts, were extraordinary. Alan Shepard, our first man into space. He also flew Apollo 14, commanded it. He did it at a time after we had the near catastrophe with Apollo 13. He landed it on the moon. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy, as was our first man to go in orbit, John Glenn, who became a U.S. Senator from Ohio. All of these people were not only test pilots, but they were engineering. Most of them have degrees, PhDs. They're actually the best that this country has to offer, and it continues that way. Even though we have over 100 astronauts now, as the old saying goes, there's not a cull among them, and it is extremely hard to become an astronaut. I know people who have studied for years, who've taken additional courses, who've tried every time that NASA's naming new astronauts, and they didn't make it. As a matter of fact, the astronaut who flew the second mission to the moon, Pete Conrad, he was a commander of Apollo 12, he did not make the original cut of the 7. He was selected in the second cut, what they called the Gemini 9. That's how Pete got in, as did Jim Lovell, who is famous from the Apollo 13. He commanded the Apollo 13. Tom Stafford was also in that group, and Tom commanded Apollo 10, as well as a couple of Gemini flights. He also was a commander of Apollo Soyuz, the last Apollo mission, where they docked in July 1975. They docked in Earth orbit with the Russians for the first time. These are extraordinary people. They're the best that this country or any country can produce. And we are only sending up our best in character and in knowledge when we send astronauts into space, Brian.
Jay, thanks for that. I think it's important that that thought be expressed. These are, to a person, extraordinary people. Jay Barbary, who we'll be going back to, of course, throughout the day. David Gregory is at the White House with more information. The president deciding to come back from Camp David today. David?
He has made that decision, Brian, and we're told he's about 15 minutes away. He'll be entering on the South grounds, either going into the residence or into the Oval Office. White House officials are here, the senior staff assembled, monitoring everything they can. The president, we're told, will make a statement to the American people at some point during the day, but not before NASA is able to draw some conclusions about this unfolding disaster. We have been told this morning by administration officials that while the investigation into any potential terrorist link is being fully investigated, that there's no indication that there was any foul play, no indication, as Jim Miklashevsky reported moments ago, that this is anything but an accident. We do in this country now have a Homeland Security department that is operating at full speed today. The secretary of that department, Tom Ridge, got a call, we're told, by government officials shortly after NASA lost contact with Colombia. He's got a huge effort here in terms of coordinating the local response as well as the federal response. He and the president and his chief of staff, Andrew Card, in touch with Sean O'Keefe, who of course runs NASA. That call first made by the president at 10:30. The administration at lower levels has been in touch with the Israeli government. No call yet between the president and Prime Minister Sharon to exchange condolences. But back to the Homeland Security component, as I said, a massive effort underway. FEMA preparing to be the lead agency for recovery and response. The Coast Guard has been mobilized. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Ridge, has called the governors of Texas and Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, and I believe those are all the states, to coordinate the public safety function here. There is a debris field that is extremely dangerous that should be avoided by members of the public in those areas. So Tom Ridge coordinating that function as well. So to repeat, we're hearing it from Homeland Security officials, Brian. We're hearing it from other White House officials. There is no reason to believe that this is anything but an accident. The president just moments away from the White House now, monitoring this with his top team and preparing to address the country at some point today. Once NASA gets more information, can draw some conclusions and communicate that with the president.
So, David, just a quick word about procedures and timing. Normally, of course, the president would helo back and forth to Camp David, but because the weather closed in today, it's a motorcade. Normally, they try to keep that rather low key because it's a mixture of local roads and highways, but I imagine today they're going lights and sirens and streets closed down.
Well, I think you can expect that. However, the time is about the same, we're told, because he left about an hour 15 ago. And we were told that he's about 10 minutes away now. So we'll see him shortly. We'll try to bring pictures of that arrival and just monitor the information we get about what he is being told by NASA, by members of his senior team, by the Homeland Security Department as well, as he prepares to make any statement to the public.
David Gregory from the White House North Lawn on what is a dreary day up and down the East Coast here for more reasons than just, of course, the atmospherics. David, thank you. I want to read you this latest from the Associated Press. It reads, Kennedy Space Center, AP, quote, "It's gone." That's what a senior U.S. official says about Space Shuttle Columbia, which broke apart in flames on its way to landing today. The official says debris strewn across Texas and apparently some other states has been positively identified as being from the space shuttle. It bears repeating, we have not had a declaration of death by NASA on these 7 crew members. We're happy to have with us an expert in this field, and those of you interested in the subject will recognize his name as a byline. William Burroughs is with us here in New York. He has written extensively for many, many publications, most notably among them perhaps the New York Times and Newsweek. Mr. Burroughs, we touched on this with Jay Barbary. I guess this is just another reminder, the first since '86, this is a very dangerous business still.
No, it absolutely is, and no one should be deluded about that. Rockets are very dangerous machines, and on the face of it, that's a never-ending problem. I would say, however, that we're also dealing with relatively old technology, and that is a political problem.
Well, this is interesting. Boeing, as you know, just abandoned, after I think making a one effort to promote it at the Paris Air Show, just abandoned their effort to go kind of subspace aircraft for all the high rollers for whom the Concorde is too pokey. They were going to try this on a commercial basis. They abandon it. What is the next step, the next frontier post-shuttle, and is the shuttle, in your view, still a viable mode of space transportation?
I think the next step is single stage to orbit or two stage to orbit, which is to say a machine that will operate like an airliner or a truck. It can be serviced, it can land on runways and reused. That should be the next step, and it is long overdue. The technology they're using now is basically the same technology that they used during Apollo, only instead of a capsule coming down under a parachute, you've got an orbiter coming down on wings. But it is a very, very sad state of affairs, and again, I think there's a technological problem today. But the basic problem is political, and that gets back to Congress. We are trying to conduct a world-class space program with hand-me-down technology, and it's very unfortunate.
Isn't it kind of like the presidents in the 60s and 70s who were either preoccupied with domestic problems, war in Vietnam, wanted full funding for NASA? It wasn't then perhaps always a national priority. Won't it take this being declared a national priority for that to happen?
Well, it should, but again, it's a political problem. As Bruce Murray at JPL said when Challenger exploded, Congress is an unindicted co-conspirator. The political will isn't there, and NASA has got to make do with some very, very dangerous stuff. It's a tragedy.
Can you blame people, even absent the Challenger disaster, or even including that, rather, to look at the record, 22-year program, 28 flights for this spacecraft alone, 113 at all, for saying, look, this has been a terrific return on our investment. It's been a terrific ambassador for us around the world, and it works. There's a space station up and running largely because of it.
It has been all those things. We should be very proud of what we've done. But again, time is your enemy in this kind of a situation. And we've got to upgrade everything and get decisive about what we wanted to do in space, and just do it.
Same question for you that I asked Jay Barbary. Spend a moment and talk about the men and women who fly these things. How, if you walk into a room full of people, how would you know which one of them is the astronaut?
Serious, bright, dedicated, heroic. They know they're in a dangerous game. they are really, truly remarkable individuals, going back to the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts.
And I guess the fact that there will be tomorrow people signing up for the next mission, people who wouldn't give dropping out a second thought, is our evidence of that.
That is very true, and I was a person who was in the Journalist in Space program, as were several space writers I know. We'd go in 2 seconds. You expect that there's going to be a cataclysmic problem every once in a while, but as you pointed out, it is basically an extremely safe system. Though I will say again, it gets less safe as you keep on reusing old hardware.
Is it the same human DNA that if I can mix my descriptions, fuels fighter pilots and race car drivers and all of that? They really would rather not be bothered with details like an occasional horrible catastrophe.
Some of us think that there is a gene for flying, and some of us think we have it. And yes, you're absolutely right. You just get on with it. I have flown a lot of high-performance jets, military, and I can tell you when things go bad, they start to go bad very, very fast, and that seems to be what happened with Columbia. But that doesn't mean you ground yourself. If you think that the space program is fundamentally important, as some of us do, if you think that it is going to be the salvation of our species because it'll get us off this planet and spread us out, then there's no going back. But that having been said, again, you've got to have the political will to do it right.
Mr. Burroughs, you know how Americans talk when they get together, as they will around dinner tables this Saturday night around the country. They're going to say things like, I hope they didn't feel it, and I hope they went quickly, and that kind of thing. And looking at this with your experience, do you believe that was indeed the case?
I think probably they did feel it, as I think they felt it in Challenger. There was evidence after the Challenger accident that in fact they were alive for seconds or whatever. And I think the same thing applies here. It was breaking up. It didn't just go up in a fireball, and therefore I believe in fact they knew what was happening.
Well, we join millions of other Americans today in hoping for the very best for these 7 souls on board. When we talk about having notice, advance warning, is it in the form of data as well? Could you have known there was a problem on re-entry, and for how long had they been in what we can call the re-entry phase?
Well, I'm not sure how long they'd been in, but as I said before, once things, at that kind of speed, once things start to go bad, they go bad very fast, and it increases geometrically. So before you know it, you're in a cataclysm. But that doesn't mean that they would have gone quickly. I think probably they knew what was happening.
William Burroughs, thank you for your expertise and advice in this matter, veteran journalist and aviation expert. And we're going to go to one of our own, back to Jay Barbary at the Cape, who's with us by telephone, having just talked about this with a NASA official. Jay?
Yes, Brian, talking with the different NASA people that are investigating this now, they're all convinced that this was Columbia, that the crew has been lost. In fact, the flag over the Astronauts Hall of Fame has gone to half-staff, and they're ordering the others. We expect in an upcoming news conference here at 1 o'clock with NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe that we will get the official word from NASA that the tracking films video that we've seen is Columbia, and the 7 have been lost.
Jay, as you speak about the Astronaut Hall of Fame, we're looking at the White House from just outside the West Wing, the West Portico, where the flag has been lowered to half-staff. There we see the West Wing proper. What is this? I know it is early yet, and our thoughts at this early stage are with these 7 astronauts and with those who survived them here on Earth. What will this do to the psyche of this proud organization?
Well, as it did with the loss of Challenger, when we returned 2 years later to flight with Rick Houck at the controls of STS-26, that was a nervous crew that went up then. And of course, we'll have several nervous flights, and then it will go back probably to where we were at this juncture. As I said to you earlier, Brian, one projection was that we would lose one shuttle in every 75 flights. We've had 113, and now we've lost 2. We've lost our 2 oldest shuttles. Challenger was the second one to come online after Columbia. Columbia was the oldest. It made the first flight on April the 12th, 1981, with veteran astronaut John Young and moonwalker John Young and Robert Crippen at the controls. And now this on its 28th flight, we've lost Columbia. But again, it's like people getting on airliners. Airline flight is the safest mode of transportation that we have, as you know, on this planet. Yet people do not hesitate to get on board, but yet people will be lost, as they are lost continually in air flight. The most dangerous mode of transportation, of course, is automobiles. You're more likely to die in an automobile crash than you are any other way, unless you die of old age, of course. But this is, people get in their cars every day, and they drive. They don't hesitate. You do not hesitate to put your children in your car and drive, but you are putting yourself at risk when you do. But these people are pioneers. These people are people who are going to expand the envelope, if you will. They are going to continue, because from the first time that the first Homo sapien, the human, appeared in Africa nearly 200,000 years ago, the human beings have all come out of Africa, and they have migrated to Australia, to Asia, to Europe, and then from Asia across, during the Ice Age, across the bridge from Siberia into Alaska, down the North American continent on down into South America. People are going to continue to migrate from this planet. It's not going to stop, but accidents will happen. It's been an extraordinary job that NASA has done to keep people safe without question, because you've got over 100,000 parts in a space shuttle. It's probably one of the most magnificent machines ever built. And of all the backup systems, of all the safety advantages that you have to remember how large this is, how much thrust and power is there, and to put it in speeds of 17,300 miles an hour in Earth orbit, do all the things that you do with it, there's got to be accidents, no matter how well you do your job. But it'll continue. People will get over, as they did over Challenger, and they will fly again. The question is now, we have 3 people on board the International Space Stations, 2 Americans and a Russian. Now, Ken Bowersox, a veteran astronaut, is in command of the crew up there now, Brian. The question is, will we fly the next mission, which is scheduled to go March the 1st, Atlantis, which is a mission with another piece of the space station and also the new crew to replace the crew that is up there?
How long
now,
can
will
they
we
make
do
it,
that?
Jay?
That's the first question. The other question is, if we don't, then we can bring that crew home with their Soyuz crew escape vehicle that is now docked to the International Space Station. So these are the decisions, that whether or not we put the space station for a few months in mothballs and keep it up there going, and we find out exactly what happened here. All of these questions have to be answered by NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe, and I'm sure that, excuse me, Brian, I'm sure he is going to rely on the judgment of the experts in the field.
Jay, don't move, because I have 2 more related questions for you. But again, for the benefit of the viewers just joining us across the nation from east to west, as morning has turned into afternoon here in the United States, we have apparently suffered yet another national tragedy involving the space program, yet not the national emergency that some people thought might have existed earlier today. Coming in for landing at an altitude of approximately 200,000 feet earlier this morning at a speed approaching Mach 6, the Shuttle Columbia, with 7 astronauts on board, apparently broke up as a result of a catastrophic failure over central Texas in a debris field that may cover several states. leaving a vapor trail that has been seen by millions of people, I think it's safe to say. These are the first pictures coming in from KXAS NBC television in Dallas. These are chopper pictures of a piece of debris in Rice, Texas, I'm being told. This has been identified as a piece of the shuttle and has been roped off. And the following is a vitally important piece of information for those who have not been following the coverage today, and that is, if you should come upon this, an item small or large that is foreign and could have come from this catastrophic failure today, everyone is urging that you stay well away from it because of the fuel used in this spacecraft and for other reasons as well, not the least of which it is now evidence in a NASA investigation as to what went wrong. Stay well away and call first responders in your area. But this is what we're looking at, something that has fallen from an altitude of about 200,000 feet, several miles up, right into the ground. So having seen these first pictures, we want to go back to Jay Barbary. Now, Jay, we have a problem here of astronauts on the space station, as you point out.
I have to go back on the air. Thank you, Jennifer.
Jay, you with me?
I was on.
Oh, it's all right.
NASA Administrator's office. Go ahead.
That's all right. I wanted to ask you, after the Challenger, though it took a long time for us to realize with any specificity what had gone wrong, the O-ring emerged and all the issues attached to it as the closest thing we got to a smoking gun in that catastrophe. What are the chances that we will know much faster that, as I asked you before, someone looking at a data screen at the Space Center may already know what was going as this came down?
That's quite possible, and as you were saying on Challenger, Brian, 48 hours after the accident occurred, we broke the story with Tom Brokaw on Nightly News about the O-ring, and then it took them 3 months to actually confirm that that's what it was. They were like 90% sure that's what it was, and they kept eliminating everything to make sure that it was a O-ring failure in a field joint splice on the right solid booster rocket. Now, they will discover what happened here, and when they do that, then they have to go through the process of eliminating all other possibilities, and it will take them 3 or 4 months to do it. And then they've got to fix this, as they did with the O-rings. They went to the J-joint, and they ran test and test and test out at Thiokol in Utah until they were sure that they had the problem fixed. So this is the type of thing that we're looking at going through. We're looking at probably months of delays here before we fly another shuttle to make sure that they have this problem, whatever caused it, fixed.
And Jay, let's go back and revisit this issue. I'm not sure most Americans realize the population right now on board the space station, and how long, if the best minds in this chose to leave them up there until the next shuttle flight was deemed checked out, fully safe and squared away, how long could they stay up there given provisions and all that's needed to sustain life?
Well, they have rockets going up out of Russia, supply ships that go up and automatically dock. They're unmanned. But these cargo vessels, they can keep food and all up there for them, but generally they do not like to keep them in orbit longer than 6 months. We've had crews up there, it's been up there 6, almost 7 months. But they stayed longer than that on the Mir space station. So they can continue, as long as they continue to have a Soyuz spacecraft docked, this is the crew escape vehicle, docked to the International Space Station. So in case of fire or something, the 3 people on board can get on the Soyuz and come back to Russia. These are the kind of decisions that they're going to have to make. Do they put the space station in mothballs, turn off everything they can, keep everything on automation that they can, and bring these people home? Or do they leave these people up there or send another crew up by a Soyuz? That could happen, and they can come back on that. Or, these are the type of decisions that have to be made, and it's hard to guess which way they will go on this right now.
Jay Barbary, thanks, and hop on the air. Let us know what you learned. We're all waiting. It's now less than 30 minutes until the what was a delayed NASA news conference as you look at the familiar sight of Mission Control. A very sad place, I might add, as is this nation this Saturday, as we've learned apparently that 7 souls on board the Shuttle Columbia have been lost in a catastrophic failure of the spacecraft. This can be a ghoulish and grisly business, and we are hearing what will be the first reports of presumably many throughout the day that human body parts have been found in the state of Texas. We know that pieces of the debris have been found in the state of Texas. As we look at the members of the crew of the Shuttle Columbia, the oldest craft in the fleet, this is the 28th mission for the spacecraft. This is the 22nd year that the United States has been in the business of the space shuttle. 113 flights in all. And you recall the last time we were at this, it was January 28th of 1986 when a stunned nation tuned in to watch the videotape that seemed to repeat for days and days of the explosion of the Challenger. It has apparently happened again. The circumstance, of course, the major difference, this was on approach today, on landing. And for more on that specific point, what this looked like and felt like, we're joined by Lowell Longmire, a rancher in Palestine, Texas, in the east central part of the state of Texas. Mr. Longmire, take us through where you were, what you saw and heard.
Hello, Brian. I was going out to feed my cows and got out in the yard, and I heard this weird noise. Sounded like a tornado or a train right close to you, and I looked all around the sky and was scared, really. And then I heard a boom over to the north of me, and I looked up and saw my cows were all bunched up together, and it was just a weird feeling. And my wife came out and told me that she had called a neighbor, and they said it was the satellite. I mean the
space shuttle.
Space shuttle. So I just disregarded everything, and then later on came in the house and saw what was happening.
How many acres do you tend there?
103.
And was the shuttle something you thought about? Is sonic booms a part of life there? Had you been conscious of other landing patterns?
No. I had never heard a noise like this before. Mm-hmm. When this thing would come over, well, you just didn't pay any attention to it. It was just there.
Have you seen any of these debris pieces we're warning people to stay away from, and have you heard of anybody in town who has?
No, sir, I haven't.
Describe Palestine, Texas for us, please.
Oh, it's a little town that the prison system keeps it alive, and Walmart. That's about our mainstay here.
Normally quiet place until something like this happens.
Oh, yes. Very quiet.
Now, Mr. Longmire, you've seen that tragic piece of videotape we were talking about earlier of the Challenger kind of breaking up as it went up into the sky. This, of course, was different on approach, but did it look the same to you?
No, it was a wide path of vapor, I guess you call it, and it just, like a vapor trail on an airplane.
Yes.
It wasn't that; it was wide. And the shuttle had already gone by when I saw it. It was just a vapor trail was all I could see.
Oh, how sad. Mr. Longmire, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
Lowell Longmire is a rancher in Palestine, Texas, the second witness we've spoken to in the small town of Palestine, Texas. This shuttle mission was of note, and put it this way, a lot of Americans did pay attention to this launch. They heard perhaps something about it on the news because of a notable passenger on board. Ilan Ramon was a decorated member of the Israeli armed forces, a fighter pilot, and was the first Israeli as payload specialist at the age of 48 to fly on board the space shuttle. NBC News correspondent Tom Aspel is with us from Tel Aviv with how this is impacting the state of Israel. Tom?
Well, I think many people here are seeing this as a national tragedy, Brian. There were many, many people watching both main Israeli television stations who were planning to carry live pictures of the landing of the shuttle. As you say, this was Israel's first astronaut in space, and not just any Israeli. He was a fighter pilot and a military hero. Now, the Israelis are traditionally very, very secretive about their fighter pilots. They don't want any of them identified should they be shot down in neighboring countries. They never let people photograph them with their helmets off, but there was a big exception for Ramon. He was the first astronaut. He'd been in 2 years training for this. Almost every Israeli aware of the struggle to get on board that crew that he went through, the training he had to go through, the separation from his family, and of course constant reminders of his military record. As a young fighter pilot, he fought in the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War. He also flew on the raid from Israel down to the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, when 8 Israeli aircraft flying in close formation crossed Arab countries, imitating the silhouette of a large commercial airliner, and were able to strike at the target in Baghdad and then return safely to Israel. But the identification of those pilots always kept secret. But in the case of Ramon, he was a national hero. His autobiography in every school in Israel, in every newspaper and every television station over the past few weeks. School classes followed the progress of the Shuttle Columbia's mission while in space. Israel was taking particular interest in atmospheric dust, and there were 4 Israeli cameras on board the shuttle. In addition to his duties as a payload specialist, Colonel Ramon was also monitoring those 4 cameras. So almost every Israeli aware of this man and what he was trying to do. And as I say, a large section of the population tuned into the main television stations to watch the landing, including in one station, Channel 2, Ramon's father in the studio watching pictures, talking to the anchor as news filtered through that there was a problem. And Channel 2 later announced that an ambulance had been called to stand by for him. They said he was in good condition, but obviously in deep shock. Other members of the family here in the country are being flown by the Israeli government to the United States later tonight. And Prime Minister Ariel Sharon has not made any official comment yet, but we understand he's hoping to speak with President Bush later in the evening, and perhaps in 1 or 2 hours we'll get some kind of official statement from the Israeli government. But we're talking about a nation in shock here, Brian. This was the first bright spark in the news here over the last couple of weeks. Israel, in its continuous struggle with the Palestinians, the problems with suicide bomb attacks inside Israel. Everybody used to breaking news here, but nobody expecting this, Brian.
And Tom, I'm looking at his biographical data as released here through NASA. An absolutely, as you mentioned, extraordinary resume. 3,000 flight hours. On the A4, he flew the Vietnam-era fighter. The F4, he flew the F-16. He was decorated from the Yom Kippur War. And his background, his family background, further is part of kind of the DNA of Israel. His mother and grandmother were in the Holocaust.
Absolutely, Brian. This is a hero bred in the making, as it were, in Israel. You know, it's not often that the Israelis identify their military heroes. Sometimes after an action, if a high-ranking officer is killed, there's a eulogy for him in the press here. But as I say, for the last 2 weeks, this man's name has been on everybody's lips in the country. He was the hero, not just for the Israeli military, where pilots, fighter pilots like Colonel Ramon flying the F-16 are very, very highly regarded indeed, and very competitive to get into that those squadrons of F-16s and F-15s in the Israeli Air Force, and he was reckoned to be among the best of the best. In fact, his most famous flight during the destruction of that Iraqi nuclear reactor in Osijek in 1981, he flew as part of an 8-man team going in there. 8 aircraft were involved in it, and he was probably the 8th pilot to try and hit the target there. But the thing was, in those days in 1981, it was such a daring mission, and Israelis were told that our pilots did it, but none of them were ever named. It filtered out over the years. But as you say, they are regarded as the top of the top in the Israeli military. In fact, there's a saying among young cadets that Israeli pilots of F-16s and F-15s have diamonds in their eyes. It's sort of they're the most compelling people in the Israeli military. And I think Israel's going to take his loss very, very hard indeed, Brian.
Tom Aspel from our Tel Aviv bureau. Thank you for that, Tom. I just also realized it is the Sabbath there, and dinner time, nighttime falls over Israel on what will be a very, very sad evening. We have a piece of videotape as our live coverage of this very sad event continues. This is home video. We're told this was shot in Arlington, Texas. came into us over the course of the last few hours. This is how it looked from the ground. Again, people have described one central piece of wreckage, and it takes on a surreal quality, this videotape, almost like a full daytime shooting star. But it was broad daylight, perfectly clear weather, a crisp Texas morning, and there toward the end of the vapor trail there, at the end of this picture, when we run out of room at the edge of the horizon, it starts to break up into more than one piece. And as we now know, as we see there, the local reporter at our station there in Texas, as we now know, it landed in many, many pieces over a wide area. And those just joining us, it's being pointed out to us to pass along to you. If you live in that part of the country, don't go near any of these pieces of wreckage should you come upon them. They will obviously be part of an investigation, and they are hazardous to be around and hazardous to the touch.